I think in relation to the Bengali community, Brick Lane is still the heartland of the community. This is the place that they feel they have emotional attachment, Banglatown.
That title, that name, Banglatown, unfortunately we are losing it. And I think not losing it, we kind of lost it.
One of the reasons I find Brick Lane so fascinating is because I think it's a story of multicultural Britain and multicultural London. So I think it tells a story of the relationship of Britain with its empire.
East India Docks is where the clippers used to bring the teas. Leadenhall Hall, not far from here, used to be the tea auction. You've got the goods yard where things used to be stored. So there's lots of history.
With the establishment of the East India Company, we see the opening up of trade passages and migration with India, but specifically with the Bengal region and specifically in the Sylhet region. So for example, tea was shipped over from Sylheti tea plantations. Also, goods arriving in Britain through the docks would have been things like spices, indigo, cotton. So really, I suppose the arrival of tea and spices is the beginning of the story of Britain and curry. It's interesting because people always think of Brick Lane as a street that is defined by migration. So first you had the migration of the French Huguenots, and then you had Jewish people who arrived from Eastern Europe who were escaping pogroms, Irish people who came after the Irish potato famine, and then you have South Asians who arrive in this area, so seafarers. Lots of people from the Sylhet region worked on British merchant ships. Many of those people came to establish cafes, and really those cafes that were established by seafarers in this part of town were really the beginning of what became the restaurant trade, which really boomed in the post-war period and into the 70s and 80s.
This whole settlement of Bangladeshis in this area is absolutely entwined with the struggle for recognition, the struggle to belong, the struggle against racism. The real kind of violence that accompanied living in East London or living in this area in the kind of 1970s and 1980s was absolutely violent and visceral. The most obvious example of that, of course, is the murder of Altab Ali.
You know, the Altab Ali, the guy who has been killed 4th of May 1978, he used to work in Hanbury Street in a leather trade as a machinist. He was a 24, 25 years old man. And that time I was 18 years old. So I'm passing Hanbury Street, Brick Lane every day because I'm a Brick Lane boy. I seen Altab Ali in 7:35, 7:37 in the evening, and he's been stopped 7:47, 45, 47 minutes. And then people say, no, enough is enough. Then we say, black and white, united fight. And that was our slogan. It was a demonstration by Altab Ali's coffee unit, about 20,000 people in that time. That was the biggest demonstration in Asian history.
The East End is a fascinating place for looking at both the good and bad of British politics and its kind of welcome and disdain for refugees and migrants.
Brick Lane was, it had clothing and leather factories, and the factories were mainly owned by the Jewish community, but the workers were of Bengali origin, so all the cutters, the machinists were Bengalis. With time, the trade was affected because of cheap imports from India, China, and obviously Bangladesh. So I would say by late 80s, 90s, the Bengalis acquired those outlets on the ground floor and converted them into Indian restaurants. And at one point there were up to 50 Indian restaurants on Brick Lane alone. So I think many people probably are referring to that period as the heyday of Brick Lane.
So Banglatown refers to a commercial enterprise that really took place in the 1980s through the 1990s, which was a big investment by the council in the Bangladeshi community to try and set up a kind of commercial touristy area.
I mean, I remember in the 90s the council would help the local businesses doing up the front facades. They would train the staff within the restaurant sector. They had created a specific website for the restaurant sector in order to encourage tourists and visitors to come to this area.
So I think the idea of Banglatown came out of the idea of Chinatown. I think it's perhaps less like Chinatown in the sense that it tends to be very, very much just focused on food, which I think was not what the local Bangladeshi community wanted. They wanted it to have a much broader remit, so kind of, you know, music, culture, clothes, commercial services, not just restaurants, but it's mainly ended up as kind of being famous for restaurants.
We really see the street as a street of two halves, and we're currently in the sort of, let's say, the southern bit, which ends by sort of Aldgate Station and the Whitechapel Gallery, and if you go further up there, it's the sort of northern bit, which ends around Shoreditch High Street. I would say it's the Truman Brewery that's kind of the tipping point between this sort of north-south divide, and it's a huge difference. In the south is where you've got all of the Bangladeshi restaurants, pretty much, and then in the northern bit, I think it's really defined by sort of fashion. And you've also got the Jewish bagel shops, which speak to the historical relationship that this street had with the Jewish community.
One of the things that I find really fascinating about the Bangladeshi community is it's one that people know very little about. There's probably only like 500,000, I think, Bangladeshis in the UK. So I think that when people think about Britain and multiculturalism and Britain's food, so particularly the idea that chicken tikka masala or now chicken jalfrezi is Britain's favourite food, don't recognise that actually when they're talking about Indian food, they're talking about Bangladeshi food.
It's an iconic street, but it's more than an iconic street, it's also an emotional street. It's in the imagination, that's why it's iconic, because it's part of the Bangladeshi British imagination.
Brick Lane is in a very interesting position geographically in the sense it's next to the city, it's next to Spitalfields, it's next to Liverpool Street Station, it's right on the neighbour of a lot of very, very rich areas, although itself is quite poor. So that's had an effect of bringing in lots of young people, lots of people without families, lots of people with quite a lot of money, which has pushed up property prices, pushed up kind of retail, commercial prices as well.
The last 4 years I've been here, I've seen 25 businesses open and close, and a lot of the guys here have been here 25, 30 years, but some of them are slipping away now.
10 years ago, the business was booming in Brick Lane, so that's why the rent was so high, it never gone down. But now, after 10 years, the business gone down 70–80% down. So, but rent is still same.
This building, I pay £27,000 a year rent. How much is the rent? It's another £50–60,000. So this is very complicated for a business to do.
A lot of people have left because of the rent rises and the business rates, obviously, which is a sad thing because if that isn't controlled, then Brick Lane becomes another high street because then you only have the big brands that can afford to be here.
A lot of London you see is being reshaped by large-scale developments that cover many hectares, and there's a uniformity that comes with that, you know, with Pretz and so on. But the effect of that can be to sort of push out independent trade, and let's say sort of like ethnic minorities, people from a kind of a lower socioeconomic class, and that's what I find problematic.
The success of Brick Lane means that the very people who wanted those change to stay here are the very people who cannot because they're priced out. This is where the thinking has not been done. And I say this is where the planning from authorities and politicians, they've not done this area a favor at all. And you know, especially if you've got a zone where it's selling food and you create a completely new one, you're going to have an impact.
Who to blame? I'm sorry to say, our politicians, our councillors, our borough. You know, my always argument was, please make sure you keep an eye on Brick Lane, make sure that it's always kind of looked after. If our councillors was kind of really kind of had a love and passionate for Brick Lane, then things would have kind of been different. And maybe we could have kept the identity. Yeah.
To be honest with you, I preferred the Banglatown version of Brick Lane to what it could become, which is a kind of like a rather artsy, scruffy, Marylebone high street. You've got different consumer groups. You've got people from the city, but the great growth in this area is the so-called flat white economy. Do the serial killer cafe people come from that end of Brick Lane, the northern end of Brick Lane, and completely wipe out the curry houses in the southern section of Brick Lane. And rather like the Jews, there is very little Jewish presence left. Will there be very little Bangladeshi presence left in 10, 20 years' time?
I think they're a business in their own right. They've come up with clever ideas to sell a product. One is doing cereal, the other one's doing chocolate. And I think it's a positive thing. People come here. I mean, we do tea, we do coffee. People come here and it's like, well, everyone does tea and coffee, but we do tea and coffee differently. So I don't think, they're a problem. I think what we need to do is see how other local businesses can come up with their own trends, because they can. It's up to them. But they may not have the support to do that.
The guy who used to come once in a week before, now he comes maybe once in a month. But nowadays, lost count how many kind of cuisine around. If you want to buy fish and chips, they're going to deliver in your house.
This used to be, if you like, a unique concentration of restaurants in London. And of course now curry houses are all over, they're on every high street. So people no longer have to come in here.
Bangladeshi young people now are doing very well in terms of GCSEs and A-levels, are going on to university. So these highly qualified young people don't want to work in the restaurant trade that their parents are working in, because it's really long hours, it's really poor conditions, and their parents don't really want them to follow them into that trade either, because they know what it's like.
So I cannot blame them for it, because everybody is looking for an easy life, But if you want to keep this industry alive, if you want to do this industry in market, then you need the professional people. And you only can get professional people from the third world country. But as a job, my son don't want to do that. Your son doesn't want to do that. So who's going to do it?
I think one of the other interesting things about Brick Lane as a place is that people come in here and they know that other groups have passed through. There is this notion of transition.
When I first came here, Brick Lane was very much black and white. It was the local white working class Jewish community and the Bengali, and that was it. I like the Brick Lane that I see today. It's much more colorful, it's much more diverse, and in terms of the clientele, it's varied now. It's young people, Europeans, filmmakers, fashion designers, artists, all coming down Brick Lane.
I think there is real sense of hope, but also a real sense of loss. People coming in and having new ideas and doing different things. So some of the restaurant owners who are now, opening up chicken wing shops, or, so they're taking that forward as well. They're adapting in the way that Bangladeshi communities in the UK have always adapted to new circumstances. I think it would take away the soul of what Brick Lane is to avoid that change, but I'm hoping that some visible part of Banglatown and the Bangladeshi community will still be present.
This is an incredible street. It's got an incredible history that speaks to a lot of the communities that used to live here. And that is slightly dying and it's going away, and I think change is okay. But I think it's important to know where you come from, to celebrate your histories. And I don't think that Brick Lane needs to stay how it is, but I think we need to recognise Brick Lane on its own terms and the community that have made it such a wonderful place.
I love Brick Lane. A lot of different people, multicultural. You feel it like it's like home.
I feel like I say Brick Lane is my life, and if anything happen, then I may be in hospital. Yeah, because I don't want to see Brick Lane is die, but I need to see Brick Lane is alive.